TopMedTalk.
Hello and welcome again to these series of podcasts from the TopMedTalk team here in Amsterdam, where we are attending the wonderful IFAD, that's the International Fluid Academy Day Conference. We've just finished the first session, which has been focused on fluid physiology and has been, as expected, a fascinating session. We've gone through a variety of topics, and I'll just give you the headline, the titles for each of those mini talks, and then we're going to talk amongst the TopMed team about the take-home messages. So once again, joined by Henry Howe and Monty Mythen. Guys, thanks again for joining.
Thanks, Joff.
So, great session, as I said. We had 4 talks there. We had Everything You Need to Know About Fluid Physiology in 15 Minutes by Professor Robert Hahn. We had From Frank-Starling to Guyton-Hall by Xavier Monet. Then there was Understanding Edema Formation by Pietro Caroni. And then Where Does Albumin Go by Professor Luciano Gattinoni. Monty, if I could start with you, from the Robert Hahn talk, what were your take-home messages from that?
First of all, a big thank you to Robert for all the work he's done to help us understand the movement of fluids around the body in particular, so through the different compartments. And right at the beginning of his talk, he gave quite a chilling reference to, as he walks to work in the morning, he walks through a cholera graveyard that was there well before the hospital. And that disease, the big burden it placed on people, apart from it being an infectious disease, was this incredible torrential diarrhea that killed people through dehydration, hypovolemia, electrolyte imbalance. And that was one of the prompts to people starting to work out how to give intravenous fluids. Now, that's become so readily available now, we've perhaps made it too easy and perhaps made it too
automated.
Too automated, too affordable. Everyone gets an IV put in.
Yeah.
And that used to be a big deal, way back in the day. When I first started off, there was still hanging around a few reusable needles that used to have to autoclave and put in and connect to rubber pipes. Now everyone gets an IV put in. And the intravenous fluids, there's an argument they're possibly a little bit too cheap. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm looking across the room here at a sort of litre of mineral water on the bar over there. I bet that costs 5 to 10 times more than a litre of intravenous fluid.
Yeah.
That is why I think partly we throw it around a little bit too much. Mm-hmm.
And if it was more expensive, we'd stop and think.
Perhaps.
Resources are scarce.
Stress a lot more about the administration of colloids and albumin and blood because they cost a little bit more money. I don't know. Henry, you see a lot of... You now are at the stage in your career where it's going to be your decision soon. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I don't know much about when you talk about price-wise, if that's going to affect our use of fluids.
Well, has ever heard anyone slapping anyone's hand to say don't give that, it's expensive? It's because it's about £1 a litre.
Yeah, no, never heard of that. Yeah, it seems that everyone that comes in, the first thing on the sort of impression and plan is IV fluids.
Even if they can drink?
Even if they can drink. What do we use as maintenance fluids? Is it the 5% glucose, is that within this? Or
well, that was a point.
I was going to bring that up as well, because that's not in accordance with the practice that I've been exposed to in the UK. With our maintenance fluid, people do not use 5% dextrose. There's a scare that hyponatremic, hypoosmotic effects will incur.
So that's an appropriate concern. So there have been people hurt by getting water intoxication, in other words, sugar and water only solutions, which means that we pulled away from that and possibly pulled away from it so far that we're inappropriately giving people only salty solutions.
Yeah, and Professor Hahn, on his slides, recommended that it was the maintenance fluids was 5% dextrose, plus or minus potassium supplementation with it, and that should be the kind of default.
Well, I think that's one thing that's covered very well, I think, in the our National Institute Guidelines 174, is that maintenance fluid, if it's truly maintenance, and this would take a much longer conversation, perhaps we can come back to this.
And that's a very good point to make, yeah.
We'll come back to this, make a note that we'll come back and do a fuller series on this, is a patient requiring true maintenance fluid as opposed to replacement or resuscitation is extremely rare. Mm-hmm. That is the person who, for example, has had a bad stroke and cannot drink, and therefore they need the critical amount of water and electrolytes. And that is a glucose-containing solution combined with about 1 millimole per kilo per day of sodium or potassium, and that is off the shelf in something we call dextrose saline, so a combination of the two, and that is true maintenance fluid. But the much longer conversation is, if someone's sick, they usually need a bit of resuscitation, a bit of a replacement, and then they need the maintenance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
which is why Henry probably won't be prescribing it most of the time. He'll probably be hanging a replacement fluid or resuscitation fluid for the sick people.
But I would say also the standard practice in the UK, for example, even when that person does require simply maintenance fluid, is that they do not get the dextrose saline.
Not pure dextrose.
Exactly.
No. But no, dextrose saline, yes, that's what the nice guidance says.
I agree.
It may not be what's practiced.
Exactly, that's my point, yeah.
What you'll see much more commonly is people giving Hartmann solution, lactated ringers,
or
which
even,
which relentless bags back to back is too much salt if you're not losing salt. It's way too much salt.
Yeah.
But that's a longer conversation.
It is.
I did pick up from Robert's talk, which we kind of forget about occasionally, is that when we give intravenous glucose, he touched on this in passing, when people get a chance to look at the excellent videos they're recording here, the live streams available at the IFAD website, which we've embedded that in our podcasts, is about the glucose co-transporter at a cellular level. And he touched on the fact that if you give intravenous glucose, you're bypassing the GI tract. And the GI tract has a whole load of sensors in it that include stimulating insulin production. And if you put it directly into the veins, you can get so-called insulin resistance. And that has an impact on both sugar and water moving in and out of cells. So it confuses the body a little bit. And I think that physiology would be worth us revisiting, because I'm guessing most people have forgotten about the cellular glucose co-transporter. Do you learn about that, Henry?
Is that the diabetic transient state?
Yeah.
Yeah, he showed a very good graph showing the influence of that, prolonged influence of that in the post-operative phase, as you said, with this kind of insulin resistance, which is very interesting.
When you look at the oral rehydration fluids, they're always, the sachets you get if you have a kid who needs diaurite, etc., they've always got some sugar in there as well because of this co-transporter. Right. But that's when it's drunk and goes via the GI tract.
Another little point that I found interesting from that talk, and it's just to highlight to people that, because I'd never come across it before, was the influence of anesthesia alone on the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, that regardless of the subject or patient, these were healthy volunteers that he showed the data on, regardless of them actually having the physiological stress of surgery, just the anesthetic alone, the volatile anesthetic alone, influenced the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and therefore electrolyte and fluid balance. And I thought that was fascinating.
And I think that's a big takeaway that is often forgotten. I think he phrased it very nicely. He said anesthesia induces an autonomic imbalance, and it basically induces a mild shock state. So this idea that you put someone off to sleep and they had the right amount of fluid in their body beforehand, now they're off to sleep, they've still got the right amount of fluid in their body, is a fundamental failure to understand that pathophysiology. You're inducing a shock-like state. And sometimes you're putting positive pressure in the chest as well. So it's physiologically different, which is why you need more fluid.
Yeah.
You do need more fluid.
Yeah. And on that, in terms of getting the fluid right, he also highlighted urine output is not a safe measure of hydration, which I thought was in this period, in the kind of the perioperative period, which was, I think, a strong word of the use of the safe word.
So just to summarise from that first talk, what would be the clinical things that I should take forward? What would you say are the key take-home messages? I
would say from your perspective, Henry, you're probably not going to be calling the shots on the amount of fluid the patient's getting when they're asleep. But afterwards, urine output is a useful monitor. If urine output is inadequate, and there's an ongoing debate about the thresholds for this, but let's call it 0.5 ml per kilo per hour, that is a reason to look at the patient very closely. It's not necessarily a reason to give more fluid, but it is a prompt to look at the patient very closely. The other flip side of that is if they're passing adequate amounts of urine, it doesn't necessarily mean they're okay.
Yeah. And also an appreciation of the disturbance in physiology that not only surgery but the anesthesia itself can have.
And you can be thirsty because you're peeing a bit too much.
Exactly, yeah.
So there's a disconnect. They all have to be triangulated. It is rocket science.
Okay, moving on to Professor Xavier Monet's talk, talking about the physiology, Frank-Starling and Guyton-Hall. His focus was looking at the venous system in terms of visualizing the venous return being a dependency on the relationship between the mean systemic pressure in the venous system and right atrial pressure, not just purely right atrial pressure then being a kind of a surrogate for that preload, but the relationship between them, and also looking at, and therefore on that he then made a comment which is again not in keeping with many current consensus guidelines on the use of central venous pressure. So he advocates most definitely that we should be measuring central venous pressure to guide our fluid resuscitation. And I think, Monty, you agree there's quite a lot of advice saying that actually it's not helpful. But he gave a very good rationale as to why we should be more advocate the use of routine use of central venous pressure.
Okay, let's deconstruct that. So I think there was an era that has passed where the measurement, we used to call it the static measurement of a central venous pressure, i.e. connect up the manometer or connect up to the high-end monitor and say the CVP is blah number, and therefore they have the right amount, too little or too much fluid.
Yeah.
We know that is not true. It does not work that way because there are lungs between the right and left ventricle, and therefore the right-sided pressure can go up independent of volume status. I think what Xavier is quite correctly saying is that when you make your initial decision, if you're measuring CVP, you should factor it into your decision-making, and then how the CVP changes in response to your interventions is relevant. So in our original algorithms from our original goal-directed fluid therapy trials, we had both stroke volume and CVP. Our objective was to give volume boluses that would result in a rise in stroke volume without a rise in CVP, and eventually you got to a point whereby the stroke volume would rise and the CVP would rise transiently, and as best as we could say, that is when you are full. And I think what Xavier was saying aligned with that philosophy. So if you are measuring CVP, use it, but use it intelligently in a dynamic way.
And use it with that physiological knowledge about that relationship between the mean systemic pressure and the right atrial pressure, because that's what's going to guide your venous return. But that was good. And then also he highlighted the use of noradrenaline with its effect on the venous system. So we obviously jumped to use it because of its effects on our arterial system and increasing our mean arterial pressure. But actually its impact on causing venoconstriction and therefore increasing your stressed volume and therefore improving your venous return in that perspective was one of his big take-home messages as well for me.
Yeah, and again, approach with caution. We've got this week in our series, Fluid Matters, that's going out to coincide with this. We've got the detailed discussion about that from our round table earlier in this year held in the United States of America, where we go into the stressed, unstressed volume. Now, Xavier's talking from the perspective of a critical care practitioner, like myself, many of you listening, where it is more common after the initial resuscitation phase that the patient has a high total body salt and water. And therefore, in a septic state, it is rational to give norepinephrine, not only to restore pressure, mean arterial pressure, to squeeze the venous capacitance vessels and to liberate some unstressed volume, but also to reduce the capillary filtration rates, because remember the capillaries are distal to the restrictive vessels, so therefore transcapillary pressure goes down when you vasoconstrict with norepinephrine. Now, word of caution, the patients who initially arrive in the hospital, those people Henry's going to be called down to see who've been admitted with their pneumonia or their early stage of possible peritonitis, they're more likely than not going to be hypovolemic.
Yeah.
And if you squeeze them with norepinephrine, you can make things look great while you're killing the gut, the kidneys, etc.
Because
so you've got to fill first.
Yeah. Yep.
You've got to fill first. So he said,
because you're going to squeeze at the compromise of the splanchnic.
He was very
system.
clear. He said the norepinephrine improved the efficacy of the volume, but that's from the perspective of initial volume resuscitation. You've got to do the initial volume resuscitation.
Yeah.
Don't hesitate to start the norepi early, but got to do those first.
Fill before squeeze.
So it's volume, flow, pressure. Volume, flow, pressure. By the time they get to us in critical care, they've usually had the first 2, 3, 4, 5 litres. So we're usually squeezing with confidence. But in the emergency room, just be careful.
But I think it's thinking about the venous effects of NORAD is something that's useful for clinicians to take on board. We're going to have to move on quickly now. The last 2 talks were on understanding edema and where does albumin go. Henry, anything that do you understand edema better now from that, and what have been your take homes from those 2 last sessions there?
Yeah, so edema being the expansion of the interstitial fluid volume, very important. The bits that I want to clarify really is more to do with how can we medically intervene with edema. And when should we medically intervene with edema? Because that's the bit that I get confused on with regards to practical.
Yeah, I mean, I think edema is very, like a lot of the topics we're talking about, extremely complicated with varying physiology. It's a very case by case from my experience, because sometimes it's not necessarily something you have to act on.
Yeah. So edema is always important to investigate. You know, those of us get older, we start to get edema in our legs when we've been on a simple journey, and it shows by the marks on our socks on our legs. There's 5 big causes: sodium retention, decreased cardiac output, vasodilatation, increased capillary permeability, and sequestration. So once you have those 5 things in your head and think through the system, what is causing the things to escape from the vessel, you then ask yourself, is it dependent edema or not? Now, to detect edema, you have to be about 3 or so litres positive with salt and water if everything is working normally. So then you work backwards from there. Is this a manifestation of a disease process that I can't fix? Is it something I've caused? Is it a manifestation of a disease process I can help? And once again, it's more rocket science, I'm afraid.
That's the easy answer.
I've got to go and start, guys. So we'll leave you to wrap, if that's cool. I'm going to go and join the next session.
The next session is about
to
start.
Folks. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Monty. And coming up, we have, again, another bold title of Everything You Need to Know About Fluid Therapy from Manu Malbrain, followed by an update on the current trials by Maurizio Ciccone, and then how to set up a fluid guideline by our very own Monty Mythen. So be sure to join us for the next podcast, in which we'll go through a summary of the take-home messages from this session. Henry and Monty, thanks for joining, and until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Joff.
TopMedTalk.